Hey there, I'm Doug. I wrote The Guardsman under the pen name R.G. Taark. Today we are into episode number 36. This is book 3, Wrath and Retribution. We are on chapters 84 through 85 today. That is this book right here. Hope you two have a great opportunity to enjoy. So please sit back, relax. When you get a chance at the end, please hit that like, subscribe, and comment. Love to hear from you. If you really like the book, down at the bottom there should be a link in the description for getting your own copy. That would be wonderful. Help the channel out.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution. Episode 36, Chapters 84 through 85. Chapter 84. Persephone wanted to stab her pen into the ridiculous stack of potential passwords that they were still struggling with after all this time. It had been 2 weeks to the day since she'd nearly fallen asleep at her terminal, and Bryce had brought her that sandwich she knew was good, but could not remember what was on it. A lot had happened that left her, while less stressed, with substantial worries still on her mind. Their organization was not any closer to figuring out where in the world Casimir had gotten. He definitely had not gotten off the planet. Every attempt by their own agency to pass a member of their own teams through security as a test had failed miserably. It was killing commerce, timing, and every business from high-end electronics to heavy mining equipment to luxury commercial space liner travel tours. So all those industries had sent and were still sending petitioners to every reception area in the Citadel with their grievances. She was learning to rely more on her department heads now, and was more comfortable with their work and functions, so she knew where to send delegated tasks. That only meant she was not drinking straight from the fire hose the last few days. Stupid Bryce was still acting weird, and he never had answered her question about where he'd disappeared to for 2 days after Samson had called him to his office out of her meeting. Neither one of them had whispered a peep about what all that was about. The common line was Guardsman business, but that was such a heaping pile of organically produced fertilizer and topsoil that she wanted to strangle both of them. But it would be more fun to pull it out of them without their knowing later, to just slip something into the conversation, and catch them when they tripped over their own stupid tongues and spilled the secret. They were just stupid boys, so she knew she could get them to bumble into her snare. Ripping their secret out of their lips that way would be so much more fun. She thought of something and reached into the jumble of reference materials that she kept heaped on the left side of her desk while she worked, but in the office document vault at night, and when she was not in the office. She pulled out the only new and unrumpled set of paper from that pile. It was a simple lined white notepad with her ideas notes occupying only the first page. In big letters across the top, it read innocuously S.I., but if anyone started to read her notes, it was painfully obvious what she was working on in the first place, and anyone who got into her office and started rooting around in her papers would find much more interesting, at least to the intruder, items in her classified tables and program indexes. She penned her note into the margin like a glossary note reminding herself to look up some fact that had just popped into her mind. She thought back to her trip to the Guardsman Academy a few days before with Samson and what it was that had tripped her mind. She could not think of anything else as her pen tapped lightly on her lips before tossing it to the side and pushing the notepad back into the pile of reference materials. She made sure it was buried from sight and the prying eyes that would make her life miserable if her secret project got into the open air before she was ready to act upon it. She already started shuffling money around, but that was just modestly large numbers according to her initial cost estimates. She was over-figuring by 50% on every cost, so she'd have plenty to put back. It was fun money she never spent anyway, though, so she didn't really care. It was not like she was going on vacation any time soon, or that a vacation would even be a hiccup in her funds. She was not selling off assets or ownership interests. She was only converting interest-yielding mid-range 180-day credit instruments into liquid credits by not renewing those bonds. It was all just zeros and commas now. She'd need an absurd number of gold coins to make this happen, and that would take an irritatingly long time to move and collect from hard currency storage vaults. So that meant bank-to-bank transactions would be fine, and the 10,000 credit increments represented by so many gold coins could all stay happily locked away from the world. She hummed happily to herself with a pleased little smile on her lips as she danced and wiggled back and forth in her chair as she thought about her pet project and wringing Samson's Guardsman's secret from him over the next few weeks. She was going to let him forget about her asking, and then catch him when he was not paying attention. Once he spilled the beans, he would not stop talking until she finished unraveling the whole story. He had never been able to stop once she had cracked his silence and started him babbling. It was shaping up to be a pretty good day. The direct line on her office comm chirped at her, popping her mood. She answered immediately, and immediately her mother asked, "Persephone, dear, where are you?" It was a trap. She sat up straight and alert. Her mother had called her office line and caught her at her desk. Her mother knew exactly where she was before asking that question. She cringed and tried to think of what she was supposed to be doing, but could not remember. She took the offensive and counter-attacked her mother's thrust. "I'm supposed to be somewhere, but I do not remember what it is because I'm buried at work. I've got 24 projects on my mind. I've been through 4 meetings this morning already and can't think of whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing right now that would prompt your call. Could you please remind me?" Her mother actually chuckled on the other end of the line, and gently called her on her excuses. "Very diplomatic of you, Persephone." Persephone wanted to grumble at how her mother had managed to catch her again. She stopped that thought as her mother reminded her, "You were supposed to meet me at the top of the hour. Sean is reversing Diantha's coma in a few minutes, and you'd said you wanted to be there when she woke." Persephone's eyes shot down to her terminal's monitor and the screen's embedded clock. She nearly shouted into the calm, "Damn, damn, damn!" She spoke over her mother's reminder about her language and said, "I'm on the way." Celine told her patiently, "All right, dear, I'll meet you at the clinic." Persephone snapped, "5 minutes, I'm coming straight away, Mom." Her mother's teasing voice peaked while speaking to Persephone as her mother cheerfully replied, "All right, dear, I'll see you soon." She didn't run, but she walked fast enough that William had to step out of his stride to stay on her heels. The twisting concentric security rings out from the most critical and secured functions wrapped down and out from the center until she dropped onto the corridor she could use to duck into the private family corridors where she could move quickly and more securely through the core of the citadel to wherever she wanted to go. In this case, the medical clinic up a few floors from where she was now. She hit the elevator in stride and had to endure a frustrating wait for the car. She stepped into the clinic where Celine chatted amiably with Sean. Her mother's guardsmen, in their unique white, secured the entry and kept a casual eye on the medical personnel performing their duties. Celine looked up from their conversation as Persephone entered. She smoothly pulled her comm from one of her cleverly concealed pockets and clucked, "Oh dear, Persephone. 7 minutes, a new speed record from your office to here. But thanks to your efforts, I'm out a promissory wager with Sean." Sean added in his Dr. White, "That's true, miss. She said you'd be at least 10 minutes. Persephone wanted to huff at her mother, but was cut off by her smiling thrust. "Dear, you're entirely too predictable. You just make these things too easy." Before she could respond to her mother's gentle and playful jab, Sean waved them both over to Diantha's reclined body on the hospital cot. She was unwrapped and just looked like she was in a very deep sleep in the well-lit and moderately noisy and active medical clinic. This way, ladies, we'll get this show on the road. Beside Diantha's cot was the typical console and vitals reader station with all its medical blips and beeps in sedate rhythm. There were a few tubes that plugged into her, trailing a few different hues of clear liquid into Diantha's prone body. When they were a dozen steps from the cot side, her mother gently slipped her hand into Persephone's own as she pulled her hand up in nervous excitement. Sean plucked a syringe from the table, pressed it to one of the connections on the fluid bag, and turned to leave. Persephone asked, "That's it?" Sean snapped his finger, turned around, and with a flourish of both hands over the unconscious Diantha began chanting while waving his hands. He spoke a language that was pronounced in familiar terms and parts. Then Persephone recognized the lengthy name of a complex chemical compound that was probably the drug Sean slipped into Diantha's eye, V. He chanted like a witch doctor, and Persephone groaned. Sean clapped his hands together, wiping imaginary something off his palms, signifying he was finished, and turned to walk away again. Over his shoulder, he informed them, "Magic words spoken. She'll wake up slowly over the next 15 minutes. Just be there when she opens her eyes. Familiar faces will lessen the disorientation." He stopped speaking when one of his medical personnel handed him a reader with another patient's information. When Persephone looked back to Diantha, her mother was shaking her head negatively. Selene quietly mumbled between them with a huff, "He's such a wise ass," sneaking in her bad word where no one else could hear her. Persephone agreed, "True, but he fits in well with the rest of us weirdos, I think." They passed the 15 minutes chatting in soft, familiar discussion, like they had not done in years. Her mother, while nearly 38 years her senior, was showing a renewed life in her eyes and was stepping out from the shadows of grief and stress that had hounded her for so many long years of Persephone's life. It was wonderful watching her mother come back to life. She had always handled the staged affairs with poise and confidence. The difference now was that where she had the dark fear in her eyes privately for so long that it seemed to be gone during this conversation. Diantha's groggy groan and deep breath turned painful gasp drew both women's attention. Persephone stood and walked quietly around to the far side of the hospital cot as her mother grasped and stroked Diantha's hand, cooing to her softly and soothingly as her disorientation passed. Persephone arrived at the far side of the cot to sit next to Diantha on that side. Diantha moved under her own power as she lifted her free hand away from Persephone and pressed it over her eyes, indicating a wrecking headache as she groaned in pain. Selene spoke softly, "Just relax, Diantha. You've been in the hospital and the headache is just a side effect that will pass in a moment." Through a diminished groan, Diantha croaked through her dry throat, "It's breaking already. The light just feels like knives in my eyes." She rubbed her eyes, which were unaccustomed to the light. She actually made a feeble attempt at a joke in her gravel voice. "My throat is so dry I can hardly breathe. But I have to pee so bad I'm going to explode." Persephone's mother took the lead in the conversation, as Persephone picked up Diantha's other hand, imitating her mother's action. "Diantha, dear, you were badly hurt." Diantha closed her eyes and rolled her head away from Selene and towards Persephone, as her hands closed hard on both sides and her eyes wet with unspilled tears. Selene pressed forward gently. "Diantha, you remember? We'll start there." Selene drew a breath, while Diantha nodded affirmatively with her eyes still clamped shut. Selene continued, "You have been in a medically induced coma for over a month and a half, while you've healed naturally. There was a complication. Celine's anger flashed. Oh, bloody hell! I'll just say it. Diantha, you were almost gone when we found you. You'd lost most of your own nano-S to the blood loss, and the addition of mine neutralized the ones that remained as they fought in your bloodstream. Before mine realized, they were transfused into your body and deactivated. Diantha's eyes snapped open in shock and horror as she fixed her unblinking eyes on Persephone's mother. Celine continued. All of the nano-S in your blood had to be neutralized. Your heart stopped 3 times before you were stabilized. You had to heal completely naturally, and we had to wait for your body to produce enough of your own blood before a base nanoplan could be reinserted into your system. Otherwise, the mixed blood would have caused rejection of the nanoset, because portions would be reading your DNA and others would be reading my donated blood. Diantha finally blinked and exclaimed in horror, I lost that much blood, and you gave me your own. Celine soothed, Yes, dear, you were in a bad way. Persephone chimed in, drawing Diantha's eyes. Sean worked on you while you were asleep, and he worked out all the scarring left from the wounds and even fixed a hitch he found in your right shoulder. You are better than you were in a few ways. Diantha nodded and rasped, I've been meaning to get that fixed. I jogged it the other day, well, a few days before, when I slipped and caught myself. She repeated into the dead air between Persephone and Celine, I've been meaning to get that fixed. She had a wistful and painfully disbelieving quality to her voice. Celine snapped her out of it with more uncomfortable news obviously weighing on the words. Diantha, there's more. The redhead closed her eyes, nodded, steeling herself, opened her eyes, and looked back to Celine. Celine slipped into the ugly part with as much grace as she could muster. Casimir has disappeared, not dead, not off the planet. He is just gone and hiding somewhere. Our world has been under strict customs quarantine since the day of his treason. He has been stripped of citizenship. He carries no name. He has been stripped of all identifying nomenclature. His treason has banned him from all rights and protections as a citizen. He is effectively branded as kill on sight to all citizens of the hegemony and branded as an outlaw. He has been stripped of all name and identification. We have placed a 10 million credit bounty on his capture for detailed interrogation. The second we realized that after his father's betrayal, he disappeared to protect his own hide, and his vicious and reprehensible attack on you, we assumed you'd opposed his flight. Diantha nodded and her voice cracked as tears rolled. I did, and he. Celine shushed her gently for several minutes, leaning forward to hold and cradle the shattered woman. Persephone could see the massive strain of assimilating all this new information, plus the renewed pain of her husband's betrayal. She could also see Diantha's strength and acceptance of those things as she looked around the world, completely unsure as to what was fully going on or where she'd land when it was over. Persephone had seen and watched the women's suffering for years, but Diantha was always the 7-year-older cousin by marriage who lived and breathed in the deepest depths of Casimir's sinister and overbearing shadow. This last half-hour of sitting with her unconscious on the cot while talking to her mother, and then while explaining the situation to her, was literally the longest she'd ever had in direct contact with Diantha without Casimir and other social structures in place around them. Persephone had always been too young to participate in the married women's social gatherings. Other times Casimir had growled at her and sent her on her way when she'd made friendly social advances to Diantha over the years. Eventually, when she was younger, she just stopped trying to befriend Diantha because Casimir made it too difficult and unpleasant. And then Samson had started to more seriously catch her attention, and she'd completely stopped thinking about Diantha. Persephone felt horrible that she'd known Diantha for nearly 12 years, and now she realized she'd never even properly spoken to the woman. All the while she'd been in pain and under Casimir's torturous manipulations. Persephone hated him even more for it now, as she realized that if he'd been trying to kill her in coordination with his father, then his attitude to Persephone herself, and by extension passed on to Diantha, would have covered Casimir's years of plotting and maneuvering to kill her in order to advance himself. The easiest way for Casimir to do that would be to debase and demean her as his target. That animosity spilled over into his deliberate alienation and abuse of Diantha every time Persephone approached her. Persephone could feel herself turning furious. She'd been doing too much intelligence analysis lately, and this one was just flowing entirely too smoothly for it to not fit with everything else she'd been obsessing over for the last month and a half. Casimir had always treated her like that unwanted scraping on the bottom of his boot. She would need to dig much farther back into the recorded history in order to look for more patterns. Perhaps her father and Samson were right in that there had been a single conspiracy over many years specifically targeted to gut her branch of the family. Her mother's tone changed in response to something Diantha had said while Persephone had been submerged in her work again. That tone yanked her back to present reality. "No, dear, that's not going to happen. I'm sorry, Diantha. Your brothers have chosen to, well, they have chosen to formally disown you from their family." There was no need to tell her that her brothers had already paid the enormous fee and filed the change leading to her discharge from the family record. This was not news to Persephone, but drew her undivided attention as she held and soothingly stroked Diantha's hand. Persephone knew they'd said more or less the same. They had never once visited her in the infirmary, but a formal exclusion from a family was the same as stripping someone's full name from the rest of society. They lost their name and became drifters. Crushed, Diantha physically lurched as she curled into a fetal ball to cry between them. "Lennox? Stuart? Both of them have shunned me? How? Why?" Persephone lunged into as much of the full story as she knew, as calmly as she could, while her mother soothed and consoled Diantha. She covered everything from the Friday evening chaos, plus a few important details that led up to it. She skipped over the brutal parts that were inflicted on Diantha personally. She plunged straight into how Diantha's brothers had made a public declaration for their family that she had failed and shamed their family by failing to support and honor her husband. Persephone explained how they had said that if it was true that her husband was guilty of the accused treason, she should have had the honor to take her own life, and to stop her own lack of honor from staining the rest of the family's honor with her dreadful transgressions. And how were the accusations not true that she should have stood resolutely by her husband regardless of false persecution? The public declaration was that she undoubtedly shared whatever happened and must be complicit. They said definitively that the Rutcher family was irrevocably close to her, and she was no longer welcome to sully their name with her dishonorable influence. Diantha just nodded fatalistically, accepting her fall from society and into the ranks of nameless. To a lady born to and kept for society with education, but no experience in the working world, no family to recognize her, or husband to protect her, she would amount to little more than a paid courtesan if her male friend were particularly fond of her and her womanly charms. So suddenly cast out and shunned by a family as powerful as the Rutcher family. Few of those old friends would not have mutual dealings with her and the rest of her family. If it meant costing their own livelihoods to support interest in a courtesan, they would never sacrifice themselves for her. She might find some menial job where there was no corporate or personal interest opposing her employment. The problem for Diantha would be the scale and reach of her brother's investment partnerships would make that very difficult. Had she been anyone else, she would have been better off to have suffered a brutally public and humiliating divorce, media frenzy and all. At least then she could have had a maiden family to have fallen back on after the fury settled. CEO-level divorces happened all the time, and after the media mess settled down, everyone went back about their lives, while the media fed on the next nugget of gossip. Not this time, however, so Diantha got to lay limp and near catatonic staring at the lights above her while she assimilated the horrific news that not only had her husband tried to, and nearly succeeded in beating her to death, but that her family had turned their backs on her, blaming her for the dishonor in a nasty catch-22 situation. Persephone quietly asked Diantha, while her mother brushed her long red hair back from her lustrous jade-green eyes. Diantha, if you would like, I can ask Sean to use some neural treatment and dim or even erase some of the horrific things that have been done to you lately. You don't need to carry such horrible things with you anymore. We would never do it without your permission, though, and neither would Sean, so if you would like. Persephone trailed off to nothing. Diantha smiled weakly and looked over to Persephone from her hospital pillow. She gently but determinedly broke her hand from Persephone's and reached up to gently stroke her cheek. She spoke softly. You've always been such a sweet girl, Persephone. I'm not some rescue puppy that needs your care like when you were little. My memories are all that I have left. I'll be damned if I'll let those three bastards— from the vitriol in her voice she was obviously referring to Casimir, Lennox, and Stuart— strip me of those and scare me into shame and hiding for the rest of my life. Persephone was shocked and speechless when she realized that they'd been through all that mess, and now Diantha thought that they were going to turn her out too. Selene actually laughed as she sat up straight and pulled the confused woman's chin centered on herself with the crook of her left index finger. She spoke with a gentle motherly authority to Diantha. Child, don't be silly. You're not going to hide anywhere. You are still my niece regardless of what those two sanctimonious pricks think. Diantha drew breath to speak, and Selene squashed that with a nod. Selene spoke calmly. Hush, child. Just because Casimir has misbehaved over so many years doesn't mean I've been blind to you being forced to his will all that time. I've watched you dragged from more than one evening on account of his folly or embarrassment. Just because we've said Casimir has been stripped of his accounts and holdings doesn't mean you have been too. In fact, as I recall the legal nuances, he has been declared more or less legally dead. No matter what, he is still walking around under his own power, somewhere. The irritation in Selene's voice slipped through clearly. She continued, It is just as if Casimir died of a mysterious heart attack in the middle of the night. Leaning in conspiratorially, Selene whispered loud and clear enough for the three to hear, You're a widow, dear. That last statement drew a smile from Diantha. Selene continued, And as for those two sexist idiots, I don't even know what to call them, ex-brothers maybe? Selene smiled as she laughed lightly. Well, those two idiots just did me a favor is all. Confused, Diantha asked, How so? Selene hesitated for a moment, still holding Diantha's hand, while looking down to consider her wording. She began cautiously, Before I say so, please keep in mind that there is absolutely no rush in your decision whatsoever. This could be a very weighty decision for you, so I want you to know you have time, and there is no rush. Selene pushed stray hair back from the prone Diantha's face. Dear, would you like to move in our family from niece to daughter? Persephone realized she was holding her breath and slowly released it, as she watched Diantha blink several times in confusion. Diantha's confusion continued when she asked, You want me to join your family? Selene corrected, Diantha, dear, you are already part of this family. I'm asking you to become a closer part of my family. I'm asking you to become my daughter and Persephone's sister through adoption. With a gentle smile, Selene looked down at the redhead. You can answer me any time you'd like. Just take some time to think about it. Just answer yes or no whenever you're ready. Persephone was getting ready to stand when Diantha's confusion suddenly snapped off her face, which drew her attention back to the other woman. Diantha's blank face blinked before her minuscule shrug and, yes, Persephone was surprised by both the speed and her mother's response. You don't have to answer now. Yes, to which, dear? Persephone was confused until she heard Diantha's response. Yes, I would like to accept your offer of adoption into your immediate family. Persephone understood that her devious old mother wanted to hear the whole thing fresh from Diantha's mouth. That was an interesting way of meeting the legal threshold of Diantha's acceptance. Persephone made a note to remember that trick. Her mother surprised her again when she switched from Persephone's suddenly cynical eye on her to see and hear the genuine delight in her mother's voice. I'm thrilled to have you as part of our family, and now my daughter, Diantha. Her mother practically collapsed on top of her new sister as Persephone watched, hugging her close and warmly. I have 2 daughters again now. You have no idea how happy that makes me. Chapter 85. Samson focused almost all of his attention on his thick, perfectly cooked steak, accompanying medley of grilled onions, green, red, and orange peppers, cherry tomatoes, and zucchini, with his butter, sour cream, black pepper, and green chives drenched giant baked potato. He was eating half again as much as a normal person could without gaining massive amounts of weight, but he was back up to his full muscle fiber shredding workouts. He fully recovered from his recent injuries. All the traces of paunch and soft midsection were smashed from his body during his now twice daily hour long high-intensity workouts. He was devouring the meal with the ferocity of a starved hound. Philip didn't even notice. Occasionally Persephone would look askance in his direction, shake her head while smiling, and go back to picking at her own plate. Today was a weight training day with pure heavyweights in the morning and late afternoon. The day before this new training cycle had worked out so that he'd worked heavy in the morning and his sword and endurance in the afternoon. His little nano-helpers were dictating his appetite and Persephone's amusement at their family working dinner. Persephone glanced his way before rolling her eyes away from him to diagonally across the table to Abigail and asked, "Where are the girls, Abby?" She chuckled and swiped her favorite capellini through its delectable sauce. Diantha, to Persephone's immediate right, and Tomies at the foot of the table from her father, both paused politely waiting for Abigail's answer. Abigail offered, "Our she-devils are in sports tonight and then have tutoring immediately following their dinner. They will be busy until about 9 this evening." In response to his wife, Tomies quipped, "That means adults can stay out and play a little later than usual on a school night." Out of the corner of his eye, Samson watched Diantha smile, a politely amused smile, as she pecked at her own meal's remaining fruit salad. She had already finished her small grilled chicken and greens. Celine had opted for a small steak fillet with some cool mixed bean and pasta salad that smelled wonderfully of strong garlic and basil. But Samson's own dislike of beans made that a non-starter for himself. Samson quickly shredded a strip of the steak with his knife and smoothly quartered it into tasty chunks of hot juicy goodness when Celine injected herself back into the conversation. Her introduction would have been cryptic had they all not known that Diantha had been following her around all week. She started, "So my favorite shadow has been doing very well this week. I believe she's the first 6-day-old in the history of the family to put to rights in a single afternoon an errant catering order, smoothly rectifying a scheduling conflict." Samson's eye flicked to Diantha as he gnawed on his chunk of steak. Diantha dipped her head almost bashfully at the compliments and even managed to add a pinkish blush to her porcelain-white cheeks. Selline continued. And she gently handled a pack of those dreadful blockade repeal merchants. Persephone snapped again at the news her customs security blockade was being assaulted by commercial interests still. Is that what those money-grubbing pigs are calling it now? Can't they see that once we round up Casimir, strip his brain of secrets, and nail his severed head to the front gate, they'll be able to get back to business as normal? They're just whining because they can't ship all the contraband that we're seizing. The shipper excise fees on illicit traffic alone have paid for the bloody operation. Diantha gently put in, before Samson had to muzzle Persephone's rote tirade again. Granted, Persephone, I'd like to see, said Skull, firmly affixed to the front gate as much, if not more than most. But there does come a point where you have to empathize with them a little. Indignant, Persephone snapped, I do not. Diantha ignored the justified anger and continued. They have enormous scheduling difficulties and material interruptions that they need to account for now. In particular, the honest ones who are hurt the most. The ones shipping the bootleg intellectual property and narcotics were profiting enough before. They have savings to survive for a while on the nest egg profits of their prior ill-gotten gains. But the honest ones are the ones now feeling the pinch. Our system is extremely competitive, and those not cheating are the ones most likely to be put out of business by those that are cheating. Samson remained silent as he jammed another chunk of steak into his own silent noise hole. From Samson's left, Philip wondered, interesting points, Diantha. But don't you think that the cheaters, as you called them, losing their advantage, paying fines on the contraband, and their added delays through more detailed inspections of their goods, are now at a disadvantage to those playing honestly? Interested while he chewed, Samson looked back to Diantha. Her response was firm but fair. That was how the case appeared to me at first too. But then I realized that there was no impetus for the cheaters not to cheat with the remainder of their businesses that never left our world. We have tens of billions of people stacked on top of one another in this city, so the markets here are huge. They are obviously not interstellar size, but still, without shipping costs, the cheaters can dump their products into markets here. For better or worse, the honest ones' prices are being squeezed too now that there is a restricted outlet for goods shipped to the outside world. In addition to that, the security protocols haven't been in place long enough for distant trading worlds to have sent representatives here to request the easing of our self-imposed sanctions. They will inevitably be facing price shocks also, on everything from processed human waste products exported as topsoil to high-end electronics. Samson wanted to say something positive after he'd swallowed, but the grumbling set to Persephone's lips before she took a long drag from her wine kept his mouth firmly closed. Selline saw her eldest daughter's grumbling and determined set, so she decided to redirect things. I've been thinking, since we do have a quorum for the holding company's board of directors here in this room, that I'd like to make a proposal for consideration. Diantha questioned, Quorum? How can we possibly have a quorum for the Kroinos Generation holding company with only the 7 of us here? Samson stuffed another chunk of steak into his mouth, while Philip actually smiled warmly at his new daughter. Diantha. We have more than enough here by counting voting share blocks. If we are all in agreement, we dictate terms to the rest of the board. Confused, Diantha questioned, But how? There are 50 members of the board. Plus, there are several non-voting interested parties. Samson knew the answer, but remained silent. Philip spoke again, thumbing his own chest and then pointing to each as he worked around the table. 10% here, 10% with Celine, 5% with Tommy's and Abby. You hold 5% with your recently demised father-in-law's will, and your newly widowed status, and Persephone holds 10%. Diantha quickly asked with her statement, "That's still only 40%. Persephone's mood lightened like the sun coming out from behind the clouds, as she playfully chipped her right elbow across Diantha's left upper arm. She whispered loud enough for them all to hear, "You didn't think we'd leave holding company transactions to the whims of some board of directors, did you?" Celine sapped lightly. "Persephone, stop teasing," she redirected to Diantha. "Dear, there is another 20% plus of the company hidden in trust for our two families' children who wish to remain involved in the business. Not even Thanadios knew about that stash. He thought we'd sold it off years ago. You should have heard him bellyaching about that. We have those shares parceled out into investment fund companies, all of which we control 60% or more of the voting and investment shares. We automatically veto any transaction by those investment vehicles which involves managers' decisions to sell our shares to the general public. Should those investment funds truly wish to divest those shares, we have a perpetual buyback option with substantial breach penalties. 25 of those members of the board that you mentioned, other than ourselves present in this room, are either in our direct employ or run various funds that shelter our shares from the public eye." Diantha stabbed a pineapple with a furrowed brow as she considered her plate and the situation. "So no matter what happens, less than 40% of the company will remain publicly traded on the markets. Then another 20% will show in the portfolios of large investment companies that allow public investment. But because of the voting share situation, the holding company itself will never fall into public control. That means that because the holding company controls the 60% controlling interest in the Fleet Corporation, Ground Forces Corporation, and Support Corporation, House Kroinos will never lose control of the military corporations, so long as it isn't forced to sell out shares in those organizations or the holding company. That ensures that the military corporations will remain loyal to the owning house because the house ultimately cuts their paychecks. And to be crass, they are in fact mercenaries permanently tied to our hegemony banner." Philip thumped his hand noisily into the table, causing plates and guests to jump as he happily exclaimed, "She got it in one! Well done, young lady!" Celine's voice cut easily into the generally pleasant mood as she commanded everyone's attention. "So now that that little detail is out of the way, back to my original point. I'd like to nominate Diantha to manage our civilian personnel division, replacing her deceased father-in-law, now turned uncle by adoption after his demise." Diantha was shocked and silent. Persephone practically hopped with glee in her chair, as Samson lightly salted his grilled vegetables and stabbed a few of the yucky green things for consumption. Persephone happily grabbed Diantha's elbow with both hands and urged her, "Well, say something." Blinking and disconcerted, Diantha mumbled, "I'm shocked." Persephone reminded her, "Not what I had in mind. And I don't think our mother had that in mind when she asked in the first place. How about a yes?" Diantha balked. "That's a lot of responsibility. I've never run anything in my life." Abigail corrected, "You have the poise, grace, education, and qualifications, Diantha. If Celine has recommended you for a position, she means it. In all our years as friends, I have only seen her recommend a handful of people for positions, and those recommendations all turned out exceedingly well for both parties. Besides, you don't think the last week was a casual babysitting exercise, do you? If she has faith in you, then I know you have our vote from Tommy's and me." Samson swallowed and said into his plate, "I'll vote my 125,000 shares for Diantha," before stabbing some more vegetables. Persephone snapped playfully at his horrifically insignificant contribution to the trillions of shares represented at the table. How did you get 125 shares? Around the food in his mouth, he mumbled, I get paychecks too, you know, and it's not like I have anything else to spend my money on lately. And it's 125,000 shares so far. Persephone poked his shoulder with her little fingers and turned back to Diantha. You have my shares behind you too. Philip pushed himself back into his chair and declared, Good. I don't have any more layabouts in my house. I've finally gainfully employed Persephone, keeping her out of trouble, and now I get lucky with Diantha. I can finally relax a little. Hired, you start tomorrow, girl. Shocked, silent Diantha perfectly rested her fork along her plate, meal finished, while she demurely scratched the end of her nose with one perfectly manicured finger. Samson wolfed down several vegetables while she thought and collected herself before whatever it was she was going to say. It took a moment and a few more of his forkfuls, but Diantha finally spoke with a perfectly modulated voice as she sat straight and resolved in her seat. And what of the other matter? Samson nearly choked. Selene paled. Persephone asked, obviously not remembering the other night's conversation through her cups of wine, when she asked, What other matter? Diantha's eyes flicked down for a second before calmly addressing the rest of them. And the jeopardized matrimonial contract that is currently sitting in limbo, and House Croy. She halted abruptly and corrected as Samson cleared his plate and leaned back calmly. And our family is in danger of contractual breach. I see that Persephone is occupied, and I have finally seen the vid of that evening that everyone is still talking about. So there is no doubt in anyone's mind as to where her loyalties rest. And now you have a single daughter again who is legally unaffiliated with any house but this one, and no husband or love interest to speak of. Am I correct to assume that you intend to use me to fill that breach? He ignored the statement and started a sidebar conversation with his wife. Philip spoke calmly. You were right. She has been paying attention to everything. She is also observant and bright, Selene. Continuing the sidebar conversation, while ignoring the subject, Selene agreed. I told you she was, Philip. I always suspected that there was a lot more to her than she'd shown over the years. She had to be saved from that monster's shadow before she could show her true colors. Diving straight in, Philip redirected to Diantha. We hadn't intended to bring that up until we had more time to observe you and ensure you were healthy and happy enough to make that transition. While it would obviously benefit our family to avoid conflict with our ranking military mind, we cannot in good conscience force something like that on you while you're still in an understandable state of shock and recovery. But you seem to be ahead of us, so what do you think of that solution? After a moment's consideration, Diantha sighed and agreed. I'll do it for the good of our family, I think. He was never much of a husband, in any husbandly way whatsoever, in the first place. More like another nasty abusive brother I didn't like, but was forced to sleep with for lack of space elsewhere in the house. I do not mourn his loss or departure. I've been cut free from the terrifically onerous burdens of both past familial and matrimonial bonds. I'm ready to move on with my life as soon as possible, so I can finally wake from this nightmare that to me is still only a week gone chronologically. She showed a little bit of a nervous tremble, while she looked down briefly and toyed with her utensils in the middle of the room's silent attention. She slotted and positioned them perfectly on her plate. She was terrified, but fighting her way through it. She then took a solid and firming breath. Looking up directly into Philip's eyes, she asked, Is that an adequate answer and explanation?
Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.